Now, how do we use these components? In a project where we imported this Ionic component library, and there are actually different ways of importing it, as you will also learn in this course. So in a project where we have this library imported, we have access to this core of Ionic, to these components. And we use them just like regular HTML elements. And now that is really important to understand. If you never worked with web components before, the term might be or will be brand new to you, and you might not know how to work with them. Well, the thing is, you just add them with their tags into your HTML code in the places where you want to use them, just like regular HTML elements. And here is an example. This would be the Ion button, basically a button provided by Ionic, which wraps a native normal HTML button and then adds some extra styling and extra functionality to it. And that's also important. These web components are not just about pre-styled elements. They do add JavaScript logic to them as well, or at least they can, and they often do. And then this button here can be configured. It can receive attributes, just as you can set attributes on normal HTML elements. But of course, the attributes you can set here and the properties you could set on this button programmatically as well depend on the exact web component you're using. Because all the things you can configure here, like the fill mode, which defines which style of button this is, and the color, these are of course things you can configure because the Ionic team made them configurable. And the official docs are the place to go to learn which attributes and properties you can set on these web components. And I'll guide you through these docs later in this module. So we use it like a normal HTML element. It supports attributes and properties, and these elements can also emit events. And that is also quite interesting. You can emit your own events when you're building your own web components, and therefore a lot of Ionic components actually also emit custom events to which you can listen. Something like a special Ion change event for a select dropdown, for example. And we'll see some of these events throughout the course. Now, under the hood, such a button, as I mentioned, is in the end a combination of the three core drivers of front-end web development. It contains some HTML code under the hood, and here we have the normal, regular, by default supported HTML elements. And in the end, all web components are made up of such vanilla HTML elements. Now, actually, a web component can be made up of other web components as well, but if you dig down through all web components, the one at the bottom, which doesn't include other web components, will only include normal HTML elements. So that's important to understand. Such a web component is basically like a wrapped up piece of pre-structured HTML code. Now, we don't just have HTML code, we also have some CSS styling. And here you actually see something special for the value, for the color, this var thing. This is a CSS variable, and this makes styling this web component from outside and applying a general theme very easy. And we'll dive deeply into this in the styling and theming module of the course. But as I mentioned, a web component is not just a combination of HTML and CSS. We also have a JavaScript portion in there, which adds certain functionalities to that component, which exposes properties that can be set, which controls things like that we can set the color or the fill mode of that button. So all of that is controlled with JavaScript. And this is all packaged up together and basically wrapped into a JavaScript object, you could say, which we can add to the HTML code, to the DOM, with this Ion button selector. Now, under the hood, this also uses a technique called the shadow DOM and CSS variables, which help with encapsulating the styles of this component so that the styling applied to the elements in this component doesn't spill over to your app or to other components. And the Ionic web components actually also automatically load any polyfills that might be required to make them run on older browsers. Modern browsers support all the web component features by default. Older browsers don't, and therefore Ionic actually makes sure that these components work on older browsers as well by automatically polyfilling everything that is required. Now, that is as deep as I want to dive into web components here, because you don't need to be able to build web components to use them. If you want to build them and if you want to understand everything here, you can take my web component with Stencil course. Stencil, as I mentioned in the first course module, is a tool developed by the Ionic company, by the Ionic team, that they used internally to build all these web components. It's the end a tool that just makes the creation of web components easier. It still spits out normal vanilla web components in the end. And you can use that tool too, and in this course I do cover it. Now, maybe also interesting to you, Ionic is of course open source. And if you visit its repository on GitHub, here under Ionic team, Ionic, you can always dive into this core folder and inspect the source code of the component you're interested in. For example, if you select a button here, this is this Ion button component, there you will always find a TSX file, because Stencil uses TypeScript and so on. And in this TSX file, you see how in Stencil this component was created. And this is not the code that gets imported into your app when you include that component. This is the raw code, which is actually compiled to a native component by Stencil. You see the raw version here. But if you are learning Stencil and you want to understand what happens under the hood, you can always dive into the source code of this component. And for example, also see which properties you can set there. Things like the disabled property, the button type, the color. And of course, you can also see this in a more convenient way in the official docs. But I find it quite interesting to sometimes dive into this official source code to understand how this actually works under the hood and how it is, in this case, this button is created under the hood.